Okay, so video 2. Why not, right? Let's just keep going. Video 2. Okay, so the first thing that I really wanted to talk about was major changes between my drafts. I mentioned earlier, I don't know if I edited it down, but I mentioned it earlier that originally this book was going to be an illuminated manuscript. I actually have pages of that. Oh, there they are. Let me go grab them. Okay. I've got my pages. So I also do a lot of illustration. So I have an art portfolio. So if you're not familiar with illuminated manuscripts, they are, mostly medieval texts that are mostly scriptural or hymn books or prayer books or something like that, where it was beautiful representations of scripture. And as a religious person myself, I love the idea of creative storytelling in my faith practice. So what I did was I would create these pages of story, and what this ended up being was kind of the deep lore of my world. That's just straight up from the Bible. But these are pages that were designed to be pages of lore from the story. Basically, what I was doing was creating what I thought the book would look like. And a lot of this was driven by the idea that I love drawing and I wanted to keep drawing. But then I also was pulled more and more into the text. And so those two things were at war with each other. So basically what happened was it was a question of how, if I made it an illuminated manuscript, it would take 10 more years. But the other thing is that my art kept improving. And so I saw a reality in which it would take so long to complete the project that pages of it would look dramatically better than other pages. It would be too difficult for me to fight the urge to go back and redo the pages that I was no longer happy with, which I believe would then create a cycle of me constantly trying to improve pages from years earlier. It would be an insurmountable amount of work. Also, just the idea of, if you do any writing, you know how strenuous and how destructive the editing process can be. And so what ended up happening was I came to a point where I was like, even if I'm going to do it that way, I have to write it first, because I can't write and draw it at the same time. Because if I write and draw it at the same time, then I'll end up doing layout. And when the text inevitably changes, then that layout will be incorrect. And so those illustrations will no longer be usable, adding more work. So what I ended up doing was saying all the illustrations are going to have to wait. I have to write the text first. So I started writing the text, and then I got to a point in which I said to myself, how realistic is it? Personally, I still kind of hold on to the vision of selected illustrations. That's not unheard of. People illustrate novels all the time, and they put illustrations in the novels all the time. The original idea, though, was that pulling the book off of your shelf and cracking it open and seeing this illuminated manuscript, it was going to be kind of the idea of pulling a volume off of that world's shelf, cracking it open and being like, oh, I'm reading a book from that world. I'm reading what they would have made. And so the idea of making something that detailed and that specific is, again, extraordinarily daunting, and then begins to create some narrative issues. So narrative issues, one of the biggest problems with writing it that way, if you were to take the book off the shelf and read it like a journal, one of my favorite examples is DINOTOPIA, which I have upstairs. Give me just a moment. This is one of my favorite books from my childhood. It's called DINOTOPIA, and one of the coolest things about this book is I was so entranced with it as a child, because when you open it up and you start, first of all, it just feels like the library. But when you open it up and you start reading it, it is, the very first intro is, oh, I was wandering around a library and I found this journal. And then you open it up, and what it is it's a story of a father and a son who is shipwrecked, I believe. Don't hold me to it. And they end up on this island, this mysterious island in which dinosaurs never went extinct, and they live in harmony with man, and they have like their own language, and they work in partnership, and it's beautifully illustrated. DINOTOPIA was a major inspiration for how I wanted to do this, how I wanted to put this together. The only thing is, one of the reasons why DINOTOPIA works is because it's written from the perspective of people who are not from that world. So it's a journal of two people who come into this world and write down what they're seeing, and they can give you, the reader, a ton of exposition. So they can say, I saw this thing and it was weird, and let me explain it to you. However, if I was presenting you a beautiful manuscript and you open it and you read it, you would assume that the person who was writing it was from that world, knew that world, and also assumed that you were there too. So there wouldn't be any reason to give very detailed, nuanced information about that specific fantasy world, because that writer would assume that the reader would be part of that world. So, for example, if there's a continent-wide curse on the land, which, spoiler, there is, but if there's a continent-wide curse on the land, it wouldn't make sense for the narrator to say, you know, the curse, because of course you do, you live it. So the idea of creating a book that was directly a piece of that world had an immediate limitation that I couldn't follow through on, because it would get awkward. Which reminds me of the other major change that I made, which was perspective, or so originally the book was written in first person. This entire first draft, and it's not brief, but I wrote this entire first draft in first person. First of all, exactly what I was just talking about. It wouldn't make sense for a person in first person to be writing something down in which they assumed the reader would also be a part of that world. For example, if we write books today that are in first person, we say, I got in my car and I drove to the store, because the reader knows what a car and knows what a store is. But in a fantasy world in which normal things are so foreign, it gets a little difficult. So if in a first person narrative I say, I climbed into my Glockenspiel and drove to the Who's-a-What's-it, right? Bad examples. But if I was going to do that, then the problem that I would come up to is I would have to explain what a Klaxawatzel is and what a Who's-a-What's-it is. It's the equivalent, the narrative equivalent of me being like, I got into my car, a car being a large metal thing with an engine in it that propels me great distances very quickly. It's my favorite mode of transportation. We've been using this transportation for over 100 years in our area, blah, 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 blah. Like, it would feel so awkward. So the idea of someone in first person writing an account of an issue to a reader who supposedly would be in the same space, writing that and giving that much exposition felt extraordinarily artificial, and it felt super dumb, constantly just yanking me out of the narrative, because it's like, yada, 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 let me give you exposition that you technically shouldn't have to have. And it became so obvious when that was happening. The other thing is, when you do these kind of changes, major changes, is that you notice certain things about characters that aren't working. So let's have another title card for another major change. So my narrator was insufferable. He was terrible. There's kind of two things that are kind of constantly in my mind. When I was much younger, and I told my mom, I was a kid, I was always writing stories, and I said to my mom, what do I write? I want to write. What do I write? And she said to, young 8 to 13-year-old me, she said, write what you know. You should write what you know. And so writing a book in 2020, you were really kind of aware of voices that are common in your field, and voices that are rare. And so the idea of writing a story about someone like me, for example, a white male straight protagonist, which is what I know, would be boring. because it's a perspective that we've seen so many times. Any book on my shelf you can grab, and there's a straight white guy in it that's like, let me tell you why my experience is the most important. But at the same time, it's difficult for me to be like, I'm going to write a book from the perspective of a young LGBT woman of color, because that is not an experience that I know. And so it would also be very disingenuous. And so how do I come to a point in which I write something that is both of value and yet something that I can still be comfortable enough in, that is still genuine in my experience? And so what I settled on was a white straight male protagonist who is experiencing other people and their realities, and he is trying his best to listen. I can tell you, first of all, in the first draft, I failed miserably. In the second draft, I think it's getting better. There's still going to be a lot of mistakes, and it's never going to be a perfect work, right? But one of the things that happened in the first draft is that the dude, his name is Brend, the dude was so preachy from page 1 that every time he said something, I was like, stop lecturing me. I wrote you. Stop lecturing me. And it was so unenjoyable. And anytime someone would say, oh, this is my experience, he would be like, ah, yes, of course, I understand how difficult it must be for you. And he wasn't growing at all. He was like born the perfect, Twitter approved narrator. And he was, no, thank you. Like, I was like, I got to get rid of the way that this guy works. And part of the thing that was difficult was I had to write a person who was going to evolve, change, and understand, which is something that I'm trying to do every day. But the issue is writing someone so close to me, you want to write your ideal self. So you want to write someone who is understanding, aware, kind-hearted, welcoming, all those. You want to write someone who is that person. But the thing is, in narrative, it's not interesting if that person never changes and if that person is that way from the beginning. So one of the biggest changes was that I had to write a lot of far more intentional flaws into him that we could see him overcome. It's the difference between creating a flawed character, which is important and essential, otherwise it's uninteresting. So it's a difference between creating a flawed character and a character that is fundamentally broken from the start, and one you don't want to read. Ugh, no thank you. Moving things from first to third person fixed a lot of my issues, that I could now create a more round character in the narrator, and one that I didn't feel the need to make so preachy, so that people knew, that I was so sensitive to issues and things like that. But just this idea of, if I'm going to write fantasy novels have things that are unfamiliar. That's what makes them fantasy. Those things have to be explained. And so moving it from first to third person was a great move. However, I then had to rewrite everything. You can't just like do a search and replace and go from I to he. Like you can't do that for a million reasons. And also it gave me I was so excited for the opportunity to go through this thing page by page and be like, that was garbage, fix this, change this, fix this, and it's creating a much better thing. But it is so much work. I'm trying to think of the equivalent, if you were to, you shoot an entire movie, right? And then you're like, oh, the camera was in the wrong place the whole time. And so it went from this first person illuminated manuscript to a much more conventional third-person novel. I still like the idea of having very integrated illustrations, and I still would like to do that, but I have to allow myself to create the story first and then figure out if that is the proper medium for it. Not to go into some huge thing about form following function, but all of my function was following the form. We always say forms follows function. So you figure out what you need to do, and then you figure out the function in which it does it. I need to go from A to B. It's a long distance. I need to use an airplane, right? That's like the dumbest way to put it. Thanks. But the idea of I need to write this story. This is the story that I want to tell. What's the most effective way to write that? What I had done is I want to tell a story this way. I want to tell a story with this format. And then it was forcing in the story into the rest of it. Again, it's the idea of like, I want to fly somewhere, and then not knowing where you want to fly. So anyway, that's just going over some of the major changes and stuff. I don't know, next video Maybe next video we'll talk about dumb stuff. Like we'll talk about all the different software that I've used and notebooks and things like that. Anyway, it's been fun. Thanks for watching, Mom, and maybe someone else. Maybe someone else tuned in. Are you someone else? Are you not my mother? That's exciting. Thanks for coming by. All right. Anyway, talk to you later. Bye.